Good evening. I'm Karen Taylor. I am Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. I'm very pleased to welcome you, both our in-person and our online audience here tonight. We have a wonderful program entitled Voices of the Stones of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine with Robert Rodriguez, which is part of the 2024 Artisan Lectures. We host tonight's program in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and we're also delighted to welcome their members here this evening. A quick reminder to our in-person audience to mute your phones. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of the city. Indeed, by 22 artisans from all walks and trades of life. Today, our 239-year-old organization, which is a non-profit, continues to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of the City of New York through our various educational and cultural programs. These include our library, of course, where the in-person audience is sitting tonight. And I'm afraid it's still new enough that I want you to look at our beautifully restored skylight. Our John M. Mossman Lock Museum, which is you're welcome to visit after the talk tonight. Our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and finally, our lecture series, a lecture series that started in 1838, and so we're very proud to continue that tradition. Our speaker this evening is photojournalist Robert F. Rodriguez, and who has spent more than 10 years documenting all facets of the construction work involved in building the towers at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. He was also a photo editor at Gannett Newspapers for 38 years and the Daily Mail for 10, as well as a photographer for Heaven on the Hudson, Mansions, Monuments, and Marvels of Riverside Park, and the upcoming Fabulous Fountains of New York, which I heard has just gone to the publisher today, or very recently. It is now my huge pleasure to introduce to you tonight Robert Rodriguez. Robert.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I'm so honored to be here. And it's the last few times I was here, we had scaffolding, so it's so nice to see the skylight again and to have the room in its proper glory, so it's wonderful. My documentary photo project began in 1980, and little did I realize that over 40 years later, I'd still be working on it. Recently, I finished digitizing hundreds of rolls of film, and I could finally see the full body of work that I had captured. So tonight, I want to share not only some of my images, but also the stories of the Stone Yard. The silhouette of a half-finished tower rises above the shadows at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. An ambitious plan to construct 2 towers and finally complete the project faltered over 30 years ago and then stopped. The tower still reveals its elegance and a wealth of architectural details in the many carved stones. But they're almost impossible to see from street level. And I want to share not only close-up images of the stonework, but also introduce you to the cutters, the carvers, and the builders responsible for them. Before we look at all the gorgeous carvings, I have to start with the capsule history of the cathedral's construction. This is what the cathedral would have looked like, but that's not what happened. Construction began in 1892, and from the beginning, the project was fraught with delays and halts in construction. The trustees held secret meetings and even considered the bishop's half-brother as the project's architect. To start, it took over 2 years for workers to reach bedrock. Andrew Dolkart's book, Morningside Heights, devotes a full chapter to the disarray in the cathedral's creation. He sums up the situation by saying, many of the problems that occurred during the initial phase of construction resulted from the overreaching nature of the entire cathedral project. With little to show in the first decade, I think I've lost my place here. There we go. With little to show in the first decade, enthusiasm waned and fundraising dried up. The trustees' grand plans often led to cost overruns and work slowdowns. Try that. There we go. A prime example was the project to erect 8 monumental columns, each weighing 130 tons and standing 54 feet, cut from a single piece of gray granite. No major work could be done for almost 2 years while engineers figured out how to upright and install these monoliths, which ultimately had to be cut into 2 sections. After all that, after the chapels, choir, and crossing dome were completed, the trustees then decided to scrap the original blueprint. What started as a Romanesque and Byzantine design by Hines and Lafarge was replaced by the more traditional Neo-Gothic style by Ralph Adams Cram. Back to the drawing board, and another significant delay in progress. A major construction cycle started in 1925 under the dynamic, although some would say Napoleonic, leadership of Bishop William Manning, which saw the building of the nave, which is the length, see if this works. There we go. Okay, so that's the length of the cathedral and also the west facade. Apologies for the folks listening at home. You won't be able to see the pointer. Sorry about that. Anyway, construction ended in 1941 with the start of World War II. After the war, any thought of resuming construction was sidelined, and eventually, the cathedral earned the unflattering nickname, St. John the Unfinished. This 1950 photo shows steel framing. Yeah, let's try it again. You can see up there, where the towers would rise. So at one point, there were plans to resume building. For several decades, Episcopal administrators faced a quandary about how to restart building one of the world's largest Gothic cathedrals. How do you justify spending tens of millions of dollars on a grand edifice on the edge of Harlem when New York City was in decline? Enter James Parks Morton, Dean of the Cathedral from 1972 to 1996. The Dean was energetic, ecumenical, and a visionary. And as a quick aside, the Dean married my wife, Stephanie, and I 41 years ago. So where was I? During his tenure, he introduced innovative religious, social, and cultural programming. If you wanted to see elephants and camels in procession, you came to the cathedral. The Dean took exception to the cathedral's nickname, St. John the Unfinished, and he decided to resume building. He realized that stone carving was a dead art in America because of the evolution of modern architecture. The Dean had studied architecture at Harvard and visited several cathedrals in England where construction continued in the guild method of having a stone yard on site and with older master masons teaching younger apprentices. To continue building at the cathedral, Dean Morton realized he had to import teachers from England to train a new generation of American stonecutters. He recruited many apprentices from Harlem and also opened up opportunities in stone to women. Starting in the 1980s, the stone yard was buzzing, and St. Paul's Tower, the South Tower, started to rise. The Board of Trustees had envisioned that both towers could be completed by 1994, only 12 years after construction started. That plan, to build two 300-foot-tall towers from street level, stopped in the early 1990s. Funds dried up, and a devastating recession hit the economy. So we're going to look at those early years and see what Dean Morton and the stone yard apprentices did accomplish. So how do you restart after a 41-year pause? The dean enlisted James Bambridge, who helped rebuild Great Britain's Liverpool Cathedral, which was damaged by bombing during World War II, and he also worked at Wells Cathedral. Bambridge worked from original plans, but he had to flesh out the ornamental details for the towers and create full-size templates for proper cutting and sizing of the stones. Limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, were trucked in from Indiana. The quarry that supplied them was also the source of stone for the Empire State Building, numerous state capitals, and many other national landmarks. Christopher Hanaway also worked on the Liverpool Cathedral and became the stone yard's day-to-day instructor and first master mason, teaching the essentials of stone cutting to the new American apprentices. Gathering the equipment to cut and shape the stone was another major challenge. Here we see if it works, Nelson Otero with the giant planer that was a rusty hulk discovered lying beside an abandoned railroad track at the quarry. A circular saw was found in a nearby pasture. The machines were salvaged, steam cleaned, and rebuilt with parts cannibalized from similar old wrecks. The only new item needed was an 8-foot diamond-tooth reciprocating saw that sliced the huge blocks into manageable pieces. Dean Morton recruited 5 young people, including 2 former street gang members and 1 woman, for the first apprentice class in what was a traditionally male field, and work started in the summer of 1979. The new apprentices were Linda Peer, seen on the left with Chris Hanaway, Timothy Smith working on the right, and in the background we see Jose Tapia and Manuel Alvarado. Our 5th trainee, James Jamerson, was unfortunately cut out of the photo. Not my fault. The crew worked al fresco for a few weeks, according to Tim, before the saws and other machinery were installed and the walls of the cutting shed erected. Chris Hanaway taught the group how to use a mallet and chisel and how to boast a stone, which is applying a finishing texture to the block. Within the first year, the number of apprentices had doubled. Alan Bird, seen in the center, was recruited by Bambridge in 1980 to replace Chris Hanaway as the master mason. Alan apprenticed at Wells Cathedral. His father and grandfather were both stonecutters, and Alan's son, Jason, later joined the stone yard program, making 4 generations of stonecutters in the family. James Jamerson and Jose Tapia were the workhorses in the early years of the stone yard. Both men also grew up in Harlem. Some other notable players were Carol Hazel and Arlene Pony Baptiste. Carol, on the left, was the young mother of 4 who said, "The stone got to me. It fascinated me." Pony was the stone yard's fashionista, always wearing colorfully elaborate tied scarves that kept the stone dust out of her dreads, as she told me. Dean Morton always kept an eye on the project and proudly joined the team for a photo showing the group of racially diverse apprentices surrounded by some of the cut stones. 12,000 stones would be needed for each tower. I'm going to take a quick sip. The dean never did anything on a small scale. For the dedication ceremony to start building the tower on September 29, 1982, aerialist Philippe Petit walked across Amsterdam Avenue on a high wire. He delivered a silver trowel to Bishop Paul Moore to lay the Jerusalem stone, the cornerstone for St. Paul's Tower. The block was a gift from then Jerusalem Mayor Teddy Kollek, which contains inscriptions in Hebrew, Arabic, and English. It was the third cornerstone to be laid at the cathedral. The first was set in 1892 when construction began, and the second in 1925 for the nave. After construction started on the first courses of the tower, which did not have any carved elements, it was time to turn attention to the decorative and ornamental work, fine carving onto the blocks that were already cut and shaped in the cutting shed. Reuben Gibson and Dallas Jeep Concannon were among the first to move from masonry cutting to carving. Besides both being skilled banker masons, Reuben was an estimator, very important job determining how to best cut a large limestone block or slab with minimal waste. And Jeep had a talent for setting out, which is making the full-size templates for the stone cutters based on the tower blueprints. Among the stones to be carved were capitals, crockets on pinnacles, label stops, which we see here, and cornice stones, often bizarre and humorous, which I loved. Here's a view of the east elevation after a few years of building. The tower crew had almost completed the gablets. So this is a good time to give a crash course on cathedral architecture, Architecture 101. The cornice course, or string course, is a horizontal band of decorative carved stones ringing all 4 sides of the tower. And if we can see them up here, there we go. A pinnacle is often a slender vertical column ending in a finial. Here we go, there we go, good. A buttress gablet is a decorative triangular shaped element on the tower corners. They are filled with crockets, which are small projecting ornaments and decorated with foliage. They end at the bottom with the label stop, which often shows a carved head. A gablet is a triangular shaped design which often terminates with the finial. A finial is the cherry on top of the gablet or the pinnacle. This is a group photo posing on the cut gablet stones before they were set in place. So on the ground, we see Al Rivera, Master Mason Alan Bird, James Jamerson, Angel Escobar, Reuben Gibson, and Frank Walcott. Above them, Cindy Linton, Jose Tapia, and Jeep Kincannon. And rising even higher, Eddie Pizarro and Joseph Kincannon. And all the way on the top, Nicholas Fairplay doing his best imitation of a finial. Now we get to the good stuff here. I find something sacred and spiritual about this photo. Crew Chief Edgar Reyes, on the left, directs the action while Yves Pierre lowers the chain on this gablet apex finial. The carving by Jeep Kincannon depicts Saint Phoebe, a first-century deaconess of the church at Cenchreae at the port of Corinth in Greece. Now, I want to take you back to the carving shed where this creation came to be and introduce you to the talented artists. But first, this is one of the few photographs I have of me documenting the stone yard. I always stayed behind the camera, so I'm grateful for this one photo. We see Jeep taking his own photo behind me. Preliminary drawings were very important, and it's easy to see the artistry in Jeep's carvings. All the carvers were free to choose their subjects for their carvings after submitting their drawings to master carver Nick Fairplay for approval. Jeep's exacting work and carving skills are seen in the details, not only of the figure, the veil, and the chalice, but also in the foliage below her. Here's a full view of a buttress gablet on the east face, showing the labeled stop carvings on the bottom. I photographed many of the carvings while they were still on the ground to get a better perspective. The top grotesque was carved by Nicholas Fairplay, and the lower one by Joseph Kincannon. Dean Morton once commented on the carvings. One of the things they recaptured was carving with a sense of humor, and he was certainly right. Before heading to the carving shed for the creative and artistic finish, we see apprentice stonecutter Lisa Young shaping a label stop according to the specs. After graduating from Pratt Institute, Cynthia "Cindy" Linton received a grant to study in France and Spain, where she drew inspiration from Romanesque church and cloister carvings. One of her stops was Santiago de Compostela, a Christian pilgrimage site in northwestern Spain. Following her sketches, which we can see on the far right, Cindy made a clay model of a pilgrim on his journey. Working with the clay model helps the carver visualize the depth and dimension of the stone before carving. Working with clay is an additive process, while carving the stone a subtractive one. She then consulted with Nicholas Fairplay, the master carver and instructor, on any adjustments needed. The small photo we see here shows a scallop shell on the pilgrim's hat. The symbol of the scallop shell guided pilgrims along the Camino, with the shell representing the way to the cathedral. The scallop shell became a symbol of pilgrimage and a reminder of the power of faith. This is one of my favorite images from photographing the stone yard for over 10 years. The young artist, intent on her work and almost seeing a mirror image in her carving. After the buttress goblets were set in place, I had Cindy pose with her work. Her carving inspired me to visit Santiago de Compostela, and soon I hope to walk, or maybe we'll bike, El Camino. And I have my shell, so I'm all set. I clearly remember the mood in the carving shed was tranquil and peaceful, with classical music softly playing in the background when Reuben Gibson became lead carver. A New York Times article best explains Reuben's various carvings. The supple stone faces of Mr. Gibson's demons, lions, and imps seem alive, some as if about to grin or grimace. The lustrous curls and lions' manes look as if they should flutter in the wind off the Hudson River. But Reuben was also opinionated and passionate and clashed with the church hierarchy over his desire to hire more minority stonecutters. One of Reuben's carvings depicts an impish face with a large nose and tongue sticking out. Not coincidentally, the face looks out towards Dean Morton's office, whose policies Reuben sometimes disagreed with. So Reuben's grotesque will be on the tower for eternity, with its ire directing at the dean. So this next photo is not for the faint of heart, so if you need to turn away, now would be the time. I just learned something else about the backstory on Reuben's carving. Nick Fairplay told Reuben that in some European churches, it was common to carve a mooning gargoyle facing the dean's house. Reuben liked this idea a lot, but decided to tone it down a bit. And I think we're all grateful that Reuben carved a mischievous creature with tongue sticking out and not some other body part. Dean Morton was the consummate showman, often bringing patrons and supporters to the stone yard and the tower to see the work in progress, and I wanted to do his portrait in that environment. Joseph Kincannon was the carver of this amusing creature. Joseph recently provided background to this fingers in the ears gesture. He said the stone yard was struggling at the time. If memory serves, there were a lot of layoffs, a management shakeup, accompanied by many painful meetings. Joseph kept his head down and kept on working. He didn't want to hear it. But there was also another reason for the gesture, he explains. The carving is pointed in the direction of my mother's apartment building on Broadway and 111th Street, and she can be a little long-winded. The gift of the gab runs in the family, so this was an inside joke, he said. Hence, the inspiration for this ugly little head is twofold. Joseph had another secret hidden in this carving of a wide-mouthed grotesque. You have to look closely at his sketch, and if you see this little thumbnail sketch here, now we're going to look at that label stop on the south tower, on the south front, but we still have to zoom in to see the surprise. Don't know how well you can see. Whoops, did I do it again? There's a face carved inside, and that's really spectacular. The photo on the left shows the line of carved crockets, ending in the label stop of a green man carved by Joseph's brother, Jeep. The green man is an ancient mythological character, later adopted by Gothic stone carvers and seen in countless churches and cathedrals all over Europe. In Celtic mythology, the green man represents the lord of the forest and the patron of animals and fertility. He is mainly a symbol of untamed nature. Before the planks were removed from this level, I met up with Jeep to have him pose with his work. Jeep may have chosen another mythic figure as inspiration for this carving of a grotesque with ram's horns. His carving could represent the horns of the Egyptian deity Ammon, or it could be Pan from Greek mythology. I can't be sure which one Jeep chose, but deities depicted with horns are found in many religions and carved on many churches. I call this carving by Jeep the Mighty Mite. He's working in a tight, limited space on the end of the label stop, but Jeep manages to carve a creature with long elf ears, curly hair, and really, really awesome muscles. By the summer of 1988, the first two zones, as they were called, on St. Paul's Tower were completed, and the spire was now taller than the peaked roof of the cathedral. The first layer of blocks on the C zone was called the cornice, or string course, the level with the greatest array of carvings on the tower. The limestone blocks for the cornerstones were about 3 feet wide and weighed over 800 pounds. A few years earlier, in the cutting shed, we see Eddie Pizarro smooth out an inside curve on a cornice stone. The protruding section on the right is where the carvers will work. That's this nice flat area. Eddie, an affable and gregarious presence in the stone yard, worked his way up the ladder. He completed his apprenticeship, became a journeyman, and later master mason. Because of his skills with machinery, he later became stone yard manager. Construction supervisor Stephen Boyle, seen on the left, lays down a bed of mud or mortar to set the stone on the tower's south side. The stone was carved by Angel Escobar. But first, a word about Stephen. He apprenticed at York Minster Cathedral doing restoration work. He later became a journeyman stonemason when he was involved in restoration and construction at Salisbury Cathedral in England and Burrell Museum in Scotland. At the cathedral, Stephen was the foreman most responsible for setting the stones on the tower. Now, back to Angel. Angel Escobar was a high school dropout who says his life had been saved by the Stone Yard program. He completed his 4-year apprenticeship and moved from the cutting shed to the carving shed, where he liked to carve fantastic creatures. On the wall behind him, you can see the evolution of his design sketches. Forest motifs were popular in cathedral architecture, and I love Angel's interpretation of a flower creature emerging from inside the petals. And now you can see that carving after it was set on the tower. Here's another look at some of the cornice carvings on the tower's east side, but this time I want to focus on the carved face on the far right. We've already seen Jeep's Green Man carving, but here, Jessica O'Hara Lowry set out not only to carve a green woman, but also to make it a self-portrait. She recently told me this was her first carving at the stone yard. So after several sketches, she worked on her clay model. So when she started to carve, she kept a mirror nearby for reference. That makes sense. But not content with that, she also kept her clay model behind the mirror. Okay. But to be extra sure of capturing her image properly, she added the sketch behind the clay model, behind the mirror, behind the carving. She got it. This is a dark and haunting carving of the Angel of Death done by Amy Breyer. She told me, I like the human skull. It could also be connected to my mother dying a few months before I started working at the cathedral. I was thinking about mortality and death. I was also influenced by Gothic depictions of the devil, evil, and death. Since leaving the cathedral, Amy has continued with stone carving. She became the executive director of the Indiana Limestone Symposium and teaches at Ivy Tech Community College in Bloomington, Indiana. And we'll be heading out there next week to visit her. I have to make a detour here to show Amy working on an apex finial carving that never made it to the tower when work stopped. Now it sits in a heap with a few hundred stones around the cathedral. We're hoping to create a park and memorial garden on the grounds sometime this year with these stones. If anyone has a forklift and telescoping boom, please come see me after this. The carving on the far right by Nicholas Fairplay shows a creature using his one giant foot to shade his face. Monopods are mythological human creatures with a single large foot extending from a leg centered in the middle of their bodies. The Greeks called them shade-footed ones because when it was hot, they would lie on their backs on the ground and be shaded by the great size of their foot. Nick worked at Westminster Abbey and came to the cathedral as head carver to teach carving to the most promising cutters in the apprentice program. These several carvings of the monopod and different forest creatures show his versatility and skill. Nick's major work during his time at the cathedral was a 9.5 foot tall, 3-ton carving of the biblical prophet Elijah, which was destined for a niche between the towers overlooking the cathedral's west front. So I have to make another detour here to tell you what happened to that statue. Is this photo familiar to anyone here? Please? Okay, good. There was a devastating fire in the cathedral in 2001, which threatened the stained glass windows, seriously damaged the organ, and covered the interior with soot. Elijah was stored in the crypt and largely forgotten. Stone carver alumnus Chris Pelliceri and I were visiting the crypt last year, and we uncovered its location. We're hoping to return it to a spot inside the cathedral. That's if we can get a forklift and telescoping boom. Now, who wouldn't love to have those curly ringlets? Add the flowing beard and mustache in this carving by Joseph Kincannon, and to me, it resembles the king on a deck of playing cards. Here's a closer look once the stone was set. Joseph was one of the longest-serving workers at the cathedral. After work stopped, Joseph and his wife Holly started a stoneworking studio in Texas, which they still own, and Jeep joined them a year later. Joseph is now chair of the American College of the Building Arts in Charleston, South Carolina. While most of the cornice stones were wide and had the carving to one side, some were only wide enough to fit the block. In this case, we see a half-man creature with the long tail and 3 long toes, also done by Joseph. Stephen Boyle says this stone is a centerpiece which allows all the carvings to be evenly spaced. Stephen dug up a blueprint to show the line of stones. Stone 13 in the center is where Joseph's carving was set. These cornice carvings are impossible to see from street level. They're located on the north side, which faces the cathedral's roof. From left, the stones were carved by Reuben Gibson, Jeep Kincannon, and Amy Breyer. But we're going to focus on the middle one done by Jeep. Jeep, as we've mentioned, was a meticulous craftsman who could carve deeply into the block and create depth and dimension. The photo shows him starting to carve using his clay model behind him as the background to create a lion creature with puffy cheeks, flowing mustache, and toothy snarl. Now we're going to the opposite side of the north face. The carving of the female figure at left was created by Gabrielle Hitzel-Cohn, the winged dragon in the center by Jeep, and the lion figure on the far right was carved by Nicholas Fairplay. And here you get a closer look at the contours and the delicacy of the dragon's wings and how Jeep used every inch of the block to carve this piece. This image shows that the cornice course does not run in a single straight line. It juts out to meet the corner buttresses that strengthen the tower. We'll study the carving on the right, done by Dennis Reed. Dennis said his apprenticeship at the stone yard opened me up to a world of God, passion, people, and possibilities. But Dennis, who was raised in Harlem, wrestled with his demons, the murder of his brother and a cocaine habit. One time he broke into a collection box at the cathedral with his masonry hammer. Fortunately, officials got Dennis into rehab. Dennis compared the stonework at the tower to a temple that constantly needs to be worked on. It's a metaphor for spiritual life, he said. His moon-faced man, as I call it, with its rounded face, strong, compact hands, and a small figure precariously hanging on, overlooks busy Amsterdam Avenue and the Hudson River on the tower's west front. Here's another view of the work on the west face, but this time I want to examine the carving on the left, created by Reuben Gibson. It is a mysterious and eerie work. A demon, a tormented figure, a beast appears to be emerging from the raw stone. Reuben worked on this piece until he became too weak to handle a mallet and chisel. Later that year, in 1988, Reuben passed away from AIDS. His carving team felt it would be a fitting tribute to their lead carver to set the stone as it was, the carving's transformation halted by the Creator's death. Looking back across so many years, I find it so fitting to have his unfinished work on this unfinished tower.
Robert, thank you so much for that wonderful and comprehensive presentation. I feel like you captured the spirit of the voice of the stones in your images, so thank you so much. We now will take some questions from both our online audience and in-person audience. And I see someone over there.
Thank you. I noticed that most of the carvings didn't seem to have eyeballs. They just had pupils.
I think it's very hard to carve in. You have to realize that these carvings are 150, I'm sorry, I should be back here. The carvings are between 200 and maybe 250 feet above street level. So you're not going to see the eyeballs at that point.
How many carvings were actually completed, and how many carvings would have to be completed if the tower was finished?
What I have focused on are two levels on the one tower. The lower level, they're called label stops, and there are, I believe, 16 of those. The upper level, the string course, has 30 or 40 carvings around that ring, that perimeter. But we're not including capitals, crockets, and many other little details. It would be hundreds and hundreds of carvings altogether, easily.
Who were these trustees who made decisions about how things would proceed?
At the very beginning or during this construction cycle? The beginning, it was, I believe, Bishop Henry Codman Potter. The Potter family was almost dynastic back in those days. More recently, focusing on what I had here, it was the bishop, Paul Moore, Dean Morton, and the board of trustees at the cathedral. Am I right there, Steve? Close? Steve is there somewhere. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it was a committee. It wasn't one person or two people doing it.
Thank you for, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. Unlike that figure that I see there, is there something about the gargoyles, like in Notre Dame, where they're supposed to be, scared?
Projecting. This tower, this construction was not designed for the 4-foot gargoyles and for those large projecting carvings. These were, And I think from what I understand, for several reasons, Nick Fairplay, who was the first master carver, said that Jim Bambridge wasn't even sure that they could get to all these carvings in time. So he made a very shallow profile so that they could be carved a little quicker. To do a 3-foot or 4-foot gargoyle projection would take it to a whole different level.
Yes, St. John the Divine was going through construction at the same time as the National Cathedral in DC.
Yes.
They too had to groom their own craftsmen and stonemasons. Was there, and they're both Episcopalian, was there a competition or were they sharing, you know?
There was very much a competition and almost two different schools of thought, which was interesting. Dean Morton wanted to establish stone carving and a whole guild method. You teach, you have to learn, it's a craft. At the National Cathedral, they pretty much got the stones pre-cut from Indiana, they could put them up. They did some carving, but not to the degree and to the level of sophistication that we did here. I'll say we. Also, Nick Fairplay just told me that at the National Cathedral, there was one designer. He would create all the molds, and then the cutters would basically just follow along. So there was very limited creativity in that sense. These are all original. These are all come from the minds and imagination of the individual stone carvers. Big difference. And I think also the National Cathedral had cranes, which would have facilitated the whole process. I guess we didn't have the money to do that.
Right, we have a number of questions here, but if you don't mind, I'm going to take a few questions from our
Please.
online audience, so
Happy.
I have not got to yet. Well, first of all, I want to mention, you mentioned Chris Pelletieri, and I also want to mention Vanessa Hoheb, who happens to be online because they're both members. And this is what Vanessa has commented. As a daughter of a stone carver and an artisan fortunate enough to have worked on the Washington Cathedral, your lecture focusing on this incredible history and highlighting the artisans has been glorious for me to watch. Bravo and thank you. Where does the work stand? Are there any more stonemasons working? And this is from Lydia online.
The project in its current form basically ended in 1992. The scaffolding was left up for almost another 12 years until they could get the financing to take it down. Then they had to seal it. There's no money. There are, as I had mentioned, several hundred stones that were ready to be set on the tower. They just did not have the finances and the background to do it anymore. So 1992 is basically when that project ended.
So just to clarify, the cathedral will never be finished?
Not in my lifetime. I
Right.
mean,
What a shame.
How long would it take after they did the clay to carve the one?
depends upon the sophistication of the piece and also, see if we can go back. Can I go back? This is the string course. These are larger. These could take several weeks. The little guy at the very end, if I'm doing this in the right direction, this probably took a few days to do, but I can't say for sure.
With respect to developing the ability to carve, what were the typical ranges for people, did people learn in 2 years? I mean, obviously some people, it came more naturally,
It started, this was very much designed as a training program. They wanted to bring in people from Harlem to give them opportunities. And I would say most of the early round of stone cutters had no background, no skill in stone cutting, but they learned. This was an apprentice program. The apprenticeship took 4 years. If you stuck it out and if you were dedicated to it, then you moved up to a journeyman. If you stayed for, I think, another 4 years, then you earned a master degree. So this was an ongoing education, not just here, cut this stone. That's another difference, I would think, between how St. John's did it and how the National Cathedral did it. No offense against the National Cathedral.
You know, it's just, it's interesting when you think about where, in terms of workforce development, you often hear about programs and, you know, they could be computers and things, and you would wish that people would really have a look, you know, in government for these workforce development programs, and it did magnificent things for people's lives.
It did.
It really does transform you, so it's really an area that needs a closer look.
Yeah, and I also want to mention that I believe it's something that Chris Pelletieri has been pursuing. I also want to mention that maybe not a stonemason, but another wonderful artisan, Thomas Donahue, is here this evening, who practically does and maybe you did do stone carving, Thomas, but also a very, very talented man. So we're delighted he could be here tonight.
Thank you so much. It sounds like the dean had a very good sense of humor, but was there any pushback from some of the other members of the leadership at the church when people were doing things like sticking out the tongue and showing, you know, mooning the...
I would think that was all part of, I've done some research on other churches, you know, going back to the Gothic times, and if you, some of the carvings on these churches are, I chose a very mild photo of the mooning gargoyle. If you go online and search mooning gargoyle, you'll see some.
Oh, I will. Okay, I'm just going to take, okay, I see one more question in the audience, but I do have a few online questions I'd like to get to. So this is from Pamela, and it's sort of related to the last question. Was the design of the carvings left up to the carver or the church?
They were left up to the carvers. The carvers had to submit their sketches. The sketches were reviewed by the master carver. Maybe in some cases Dean Morton and a few others had say, but I don't think they were very heavy-handed in terms of trying to rein them in. I think they wanted their imagination, they wanted their designs, they wanted their interpretation to come out. They did not want it to be stifled.
Right, this is a follow-up to even that question, again from Pamela. She comments, it's curious that the sculptors chose often themselves as the subject. Was that a common tradition?
There was only 1 or 2 cases of that.
Right, okay. This is from Penny Howell. How did they get the stones up to the tower without cranes?
We had, I'll say we, okay, and I want to introduce Ray Duggan, who probably brought up half or more of the, oh my goodness.
Bravo, bravo.
Did you sneak in? I did not see you. Ah.
There was an electrical hoist that took everything up to the tower, and then it's a chain from one side all the way around to the other, 33 feet along each way. Any others?
Well, actually, here's a question that you and some of your colleagues here tonight can answer. Where did the stone carvers go after the work ended? Did they continue in the US and Europe with their craft and trade?
To my knowledge, I don't know about Jessica. Steve worked in a number of projects. He worked on Albany Cathedral. He worked at CUNY College doing the restoration of the terracotta right there as a
Big
project,
job.
as a project manager. He also worked down in one of the courthouses. Chris Pelletieri has been carving stone for the last 20 years since he left. As you said, Joe Kincannon worked in other places. Some of us are sort of still in the field. I actually worked in it a little while afterwards, and now I work in Central Park. So I've worked there for 30 years almost. Me and Eddie worked at the same job, one after each other, restoring fireplaces. So we stayed, a number of us stayed within the trade, and then some found other things to do. Oh,
Yeah.
oh, I've worked all over Central Park, so I can't say that too much.
But can you repeat what?
I helped set up the restoration project for the Bethesda tiles when it was in its infancy.
There you go. See?
Thank you. We're really so delighted that you can all be here this evening. So thank you. There was one final question, but I know that Robert, I'm sure will be happy to answer questions after the presentation
Sure,
ended.
absolutely.
So where was the gentleman who, or perhaps, okay, I thought there was someone over here. Oh, okay.
The question was just answered. I had a question about whether they began to work on other projects here in the city, and that was just answered. So that was great.
It was you? Okay, fine. Final question.
Final question. When St. John the Divine was being conceived and built, that was the high point of what they call the episcocrats, where anybody who wanted to be anybody in New York had to at least officially join the Episcopal Church, whether it was Augustus Schönberg, a nice German Jew who became August Belmont, and somebody asked him once what was the difference between being a Jew and being an Episcopalian, and he said, I was a non-practicing Jew and became a non-practicing Episcopalian. Well, that was the golden age of the Episcocrats. What does St. John the Divine represent today?
I think it's trying to find its ground now, because all religions change so much, and it's just not where it used to be. I was at service on Sunday, and maybe there were 50 people in a cathedral that can hold 3,000. So it's just evolving. As I said, the building project is not going to come back anytime in my lifetime, but it's still, for me anyway, it's my spiritual home. It's been my spiritual home for over 40 years, and it's just a very special place.
Bravo, thank you. Robert, I would like to extend our huge thanks to you for conveying the cathedral's history, for celebrating the work of these wonderful artisans. And as I said, we are so thrilled that a number of them could be present this evening. It really means a huge amount that you could be here. And as I said at the start, you really captured in your talk and through your photographs the spirit of the cathedral and the stonemasons. So thank you so much. And to say a few concluding words, it's Victoria Dangle, our Executive Director.
Thank you. And Robert, if you made it your spiritual home, it's just amazing the way you brought, the stone carvers to light and you told their stories. You immortalized them in a way, because I don't think there's anybody in the audience who will look at that cathedral in the same way. And, or any, structure for that matter. I have to say, from personal experience here, I really do think about the craftsmen more than you would imagine, because I can't believe what they did and that it still stands and it still speaks to us if you look up. And I'm always amazed at the Chrysler Building, which I pass, morning, noon, night, and how many different appearances it has. Sometimes it looks like stone, sometimes it looks like metal, so it's always such a treat. And I see that you capture that, of course, in your photography with the subtle light, in each photograph. So thank you so much for this great evening. And I just want to go to what is your name? Yes, Ray? Yes. And Ray, the thing about, life and New York, and, I would pass Ray on the street, and what a story you have in what you've touched. So thank you for your work and your enthusiastic supporter. Everyone should have someone encouraging them. Yeah, you should be really proud of what you've done. So thank you. You're a good friend. All right, thank you.
So practically, finally, I would like to present a little memento of tonight, a couple of your photographs, so you can remember this special talk that you gave us this evening. And I also want to mention that our next lecture coming up actually touches upon some of the themes that were mentioned at the conclusion of the talk. Anchoring neighborhoods, historic religious institutes in service of the wider community. And that's a panel discussion that is, basically has been organized by the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and that's on Tuesday, May 7th. But now, for the moment, I know, sir, you have a question, but I think we're going to, right. For our online audience, the gentleman at the back of the room just basically extended his thanks to you for learning about the work of the stone masons and capturing it in your photographs. I hope that more or less captures what you said. So please, in-person audience, now join us for a glass of wine, and we look forward to seeing you in a number of weeks. And a final thanks to Robert for your splendid presentation. Thank you so much.